Hi, Rhema. It's week 17, day 2 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we are in 1 Samuel chapter 13. We saw yesterday that Saul has led his people in battle. He's leading Israel courageously. And even as we're going to see Saul's failure right now, outwardly by all appearances, he seems to be doing a good job as king. He stands out in his physical appearance and he's leading them courageously in battle. In chapter 12, he led them to defeat the Ammonites, and now in chapter 13, they're in a fight against the Philistines. The Philistines are those opponents who seem to never go away in the Old Testament. They pop up all over the place. And the story in 1 Samuel 13 is quite simple. Saul has been told by Samuel to wait for 7 days, and Samuel will show up and will offer offerings before the Lord, as the Lord will bless them before they go into battle. Samuel will come and give Saul, the king, instructions. All he has to do is wait. But the narrative tells us that as the week progresses, those 7 days pass by, it seems like the Israelites, they are getting fearful. They are quivering and they're wavering and they're getting ready to abandon Saul. And Saul becomes impatient. And Saul seems to direct his priests to offer those offerings instead of waiting upon Samuel. And immediately when this happens, Samuel shows up and he asks Saul, "What have you done, Saul?" "Saul, I told you what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to wait." And after Samuel asks Saul these questions, Saul begins making these excuses and saying, the Philistines were coming upon us and the soldiers were getting ready to abandon us and we needed the Lord's favor, and so I did what I thought I needed to do. And, honestly, for a long time, I thought that Saul's great sin here was that he basically got out of his lane, that he wasn't doing the job as king, that he was trying to be priest. But actually, Saul and kings are allowed to make offerings at a certain time. The text actually is indicating that he directed his priest to make the offering. And his real sin, his great sin, is that he's not obeying the prophet of God. He's not obeying the voice of the Lord. So even all the way back in Deuteronomy 17 and 18, when Moses, on behalf of God, tells them that they will have a king one day and that there will be prophets, and here's how you're to test the prophets, the false prophets versus the true prophets, and here's what kings are going to do, and kings are supposed to listen to the voice of the Lord. But Saul has not done that, and this is his great sin. This is why God now tells him through Samuel that his kingdom will not extend throughout the generations. He has not obeyed the voice of the Lord, and so therefore, chapter 13 there in verses 14, "Now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart." And so we understand that this is not Saul. As we continue in the story, we're going to see that David is a king after God's own heart. David is not perfect, just as Saul is not perfect. But Saul already in his kingdom is showing that he's not God's man. He's not the one after God's own heart. And really the rest of this first book of Samuel is really giving us this contrast. That's why we keep reading about Saul, even though God has already said, your kingdom will not pass to the next generation. But the other part of our reading for today is Psalm chapter 72. Psalm 72, the inscription tells us that it's written by Solomon. And so Solomon, being the son of David, he also is not the ultimate promised king. We see in David's Psalms that David is pointing forward to a future king, but it's not his son Solomon, because Solomon writes Psalm 72 and he's pointing forward to the future perfect king. So even as David is a man after God's own heart, and even as his son Solomon does many good things before he also sins grievously, they're all pointing us forward to the one true king, the only king who is really after God's own heart fully and truly, and that is God himself, our King Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so this story reminds us that Saul is not the one we're looking for. And we're going to keep looking and seeing that David is not the one we're looking for. Christ is the one that we are looking for. Here's a summary of today's reading.
For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.